at the Center for Bounded Rationality at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. He was born in Heilbronn, Germany, and his research focuses on psychology of human judgment and decision making. His key research areas are bounded rationality, which we all know, then learning about risks through description and experience, then boosting, and also deliberate ignorance. About his background, he did his PhD from University of Constance in psychology in 1995. Post that, he moved to Munich Max Planck Institute for Psychological Research, and which the lab then moved to Berlin in 1997. He finished his habilitation in 2003 from Free University at Berlin, and post that he joined University of Basel in Switzerland for research for applied cognitive sciences. He then did full professorship from 2005 onwards in for cognitive and decision sciences. And along with this, he has also won many awards. I would like to mention a few. He has been honored with the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize in 2017, which is Germany's most prestigious research award for his work on human judgment and decision making. And he's also got media coverage from newspapers like New York Times. So let's give him a big round of applause, Dr. Hertwig.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Oops. Can you hear me? Yes. So it seems to be on. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get started. What would I like to do in that talk? What I would like to do is I first will speak a little bit about this construct of bounded rationality. What exactly is it? And I will introduce you to three different interpretations of bounded rationality. Now, why is that important? It is important because at least two of these interpretations actually give rise to two different ways of informing public policy. And they are quite distinct, these two approaches to public policy. One is called nudging, which I think many, who has heard the name or the concept of nudging? Oh, okay. Okay, then I have to tell you more about nudging. And nudging has become very famous. There's another approach that I've come to call, and others, boosting. And we will I give you a few examples, and we will try to work out what the differences are between nudging and boosting. But keep in mind that the connection between the theoretical construct and the policy approach is really important. And when you become a policymaker, or when you start to consult policymakers, you should keep these theoretical distinctions in mind. Because other than that, everything will be mushy. Everything will be muddy waters. And I don't want you to walk in muddy waters. I want you to have a clear mind. And no matter whether you end up on the side of nudging or on the side of boosting or on both sides, I want you to be theoretically very clear what you are proposing to the policymaker. So that's really the point and the objective of this talk. Okay? So let's start out with talking a little bit about bounded rationality. And there I have to introduce you to this person, and you actually saw that earlier in Madhu's presentation. That's Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon is considered to be the father of the notion of bounded rationality. And when he try to describe what he had in mind or what the scope of bounded rationality is, then he basically said this sentence. He said, I'm interested in how human beings reason when the conditions for rationality postulated by the model of neoclassic economics are not met. And basically what he is saying is, I'm interested in most of the world, because the conditions of classic rationality, the classic economic model, are hardly ever met. And I will talk about that in a minute. And then he said, okay, so there is this area, there is this world, this ideal world, maybe when we are playing the lotteries, then we can apply those conditions. But outside of that world, there's something else going on. And this something else is the scope of bounded rationality. So you could also say it's an iceberg, and most of bounded rationality is under the water level. That's really what bounded rationality is. And the tip, that's the classic economic, the world of the classic economic models. Now, what he then, let me describe you a little bit more about why this world that he called Olympian rationality, why this is so unrealistic in psychological terms. And with that, let's go to another person. This other person is Ralph Keeney. Ralph Keeney is one of the most important decision scientists there were. Ralph Keeney was also in the business of consulting others to make good decisions. So he was what's called a decision analyst. And he had this depiction of what Olympian rationality implies. And once you look at it, you immediately see, well, this is not the way I make decisions, right? So what he basically said is that there is a first stage. You are facing a decision problem, and what you're supposed to do first is you need to specify your objectives. What are the goals? What are the targets that you try to achieve? You also need to think about what are the attributes of the decision problem? How can I even describe that? Once you've done that, then you think about what alternatives are at my availability. So you spell out all the alternatives that you have. Okay, once you're done with that, we come to the next step, which is very demanding, because in the next step, you need to determine the consequences of these various actions. And not just the magnitude of the consequences, but unfortunately, you also need to know the probabilities. Otherwise, how would you calculate the expected utility of those behaviors? Now, that is, of course, extremely difficult, because very often, we don't know the probabilities. We can maybe guesstimate them, but surprises happen all the time. If you look at the world these days, you know that surprises happen all the time, things that are not anticipated. So the assumption that we could assign magnitude and probabilities is a very strong one. Then you go into the next step. In the next step, what you're supposed to do, you're supposed to think about what are the values of the decision maker. Now here you have all the alternatives that the decision maker has. Now you need to think about what's the value system of the decision maker, and how does that map onto the alternatives. And once you are done with that, then you know what the best decision is. Now, Ralph Keeney was totally aware that this is an enormously big task. And he pointed out all kinds of complexities. The complexities are listed here on the bottom. And they include, for instance, the fact that in many situations we not just have one objective, but we have several objectives. Now, optimize over several objectives, that's a very hard thing to do. Or, same point that I raised earlier, how we are supposed to know all future states of the world and thereby infer what the probabilities of the outcomes are. That's, again, as you know, that's a totally unrealistic assumption. So that's really what Herbert Simon had in mind when he was referring to that notion of Olympian ideas. Now, he was not, he was, in the beginning at least, he was in awe of Olympian rationality. But what he also said is that that's an idea that deserves a place in the Plantonian heaven of ideas. In other words, it's for the gods of us, not for the mere mortals, not we who actually have to make decisions. And the question is, so then what do the other guys do? What do we do when we make decisions? So in other words, what is bounded rationality? Now, Herbert Simon wasn't necessarily always very clear as to what he has in mind when he talks about bounded rationality, but when you look at the literature over the years, then basically three different notions have emerged. And the first notion is this one. It's what's called optimization under constraint. Some people also refer to it as if rationality, because it's very clear this is again not how we make decisions, but it's just a redescription of how optimal decisions should look like. And Ken Arrow, a Nobel Prize laureate, basically very convinced, said bounded rationality procedures are in fact fully optimal procedures when one takes account of the cost of computation in addition to the benefits and costs inherent in the problem. So in other words, the problem of our limited knowledge about the world and our limitations in our cognitive capacities is simply solved by assuming all these optimal things that we do, but then on top of that, we also go through a calculation whether it's worth to search for more information, whether the cognitive effort is worth being invested. In other words, it makes everything even more complex. And Herbert Simon was profoundly appalled by that interpretation. In fact, at some point he said, I would want to sue the people who proposed that to be bounded rationality, because it's almost a caricature of bounded rationality. That's exactly not what I had in mind. Now there's a second interpretation, and that's an interpretation Madhu already pointed at, and that's an interpretation that has been associated with the work of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two psychologists, who basically have worked on what's called the Heuristics and Biases Research Program. And what Kahneman, after he received the Nobel Prize, said in this publication here is, this is what we had in mind. And Kahneman says, our research attempted to obtain a map of bounded rationality by exploring the systematic biases that separate the beliefs that people have and the choices they make from the optimal beliefs and the choices assumed in rational agent models. So what Kahneman does is he basically accepts the Platonian idea of Olympian rationality. And then he says, now let's look at what people actually do, and what we then, if we do that, then what we see, there are many deviations. And those deviations, often called cognitive illusions, biases, errors, mistakes that people make, those we call bounded rationality. That's the essence. The essence of bounded rationality is deviation from the optimal solution. That has been a very important and very influential interpretation of bounded rationality. But let's come to a third one, and that's one that is very much associated with the work that we, Gerd Gigerenzer, many people sitting in this room in the first row, and myself have been doing over 20, 30 years, and that's trying to figure out an alternative interpretation of bounded rationality. We call that homo heuristicus, or ecological rationality. And here's a quote by Gerd Gigerenzer and Reinhard Selten, another Nobel Prize laureate in economics, who described bounded rationality as this: models of bounded rationality describe how a judgment or decision is reached. So in other words, we are walking away from the as-if view. Now we really want to know, how do people do it? What are the processes? So there's a strong emphasis on the process, rather than merely the outcome of the decision. And these models describe the class of environments in which these heuristics will succeed or fail. And that's very important, because what it means is that we should not just look inside. That's anyhow hard to look inside, but we should look at the world, and we should see under what circumstances in the world does a strategy work and when does it fail. So the question is no longer whether people are irrational or rational. The question rather is, under what environmental circumstances does a particular strategy, whether it's simple or complex, work, and when does it fail? That becomes the question of ecological rationality, and that is, in the view of these people, including myself, that's the view of bounded rationality. Now, this particular view has been worked out in many papers. But if you want to get a full picture of it, or a quick picture, no, it's not that quick, a picture of this view, then you should read these 3 books. At least you should have a look at these 3 books. Now, these were the books that in which a lot of this work has been summarized. The first one is Simple Heuristic That Make Us Smart. This is decidedly talking about the heuristic part, such as take the best and recognition heuristic, to give you just a few examples, and I bet that you will hear more about them in the days to come. In the book Ecological Rationality, that was looking at the environment side and looking at the interaction of the heuristics with the environment. And in the third book, Simple Heuristics in a Social World, we took up the challenge and tried to find out whether in the social world that many people consider very complex, because they are strategic agents, things get very complicated in the social world, whether in those worlds simple heuristics still work. If in case you are interested even more, then there's a very recent book by my research center, the Center of Adaptive Rationality, and in this book we extended the view of ecological rationality not just to heuristics, but also to learning processes and to other decision-making processes such as collective intelligence. And what's, in my view, pretty cool about the book is it has a lot of interactive features. So if you want to play around with data sets and heuristics, that's a good starting point. Okay, let's go back to these 2 interpretations. These are really the ones that are most interesting conceptually, and where a lot of the debate over the last 10 to 20 years unfolded and is even more unfolding. That debate is not yet settled. What is bounded rationality? Is it irrationality or is it ecological rationality? Now, you could argue, well, that's fine, yeah, but why is that interesting? Isn't that just basically a debate in the ivory tower of academia. What is the big difference? Now, the big difference is this. If you take one or the other position, that has implication for how you want to solve problems in the world. So in other words, it's not just a pure academic discussion. The way you think about the mind, the way you think about people's rationality or lack thereof will inform you of how to approach problems in the world. Other problems in the world? Well, I think I probably don't need to convince you, but let me give you a few examples. This is a list of the 10 largest threats to global health in 2019, at least according to the World Health Organization. And what they list are things such as air pollution and climate change, non-communicable diseases, and they refer with that to heart attack and and cancer, the global influenza pandemic, fragiles and vulnerable settings, forcing people to leave their home place and migrating to other countries or other regions, antimicrobial resistance, Ebola and other high-threat pathogens, weak primary health care, vaccine hesitancy, and dengue fever, and finally HIV. Now, I point out this list because almost all of what is listed here requires science and engineering, but it also requires behavior. It requires us understanding how we can change human behavior. Without our contribution as behavioral scientists, you will not solve these problems. Right? In other words, this requires the concerted effort of the sciences and the behavioral sciences. And these are just the health threats. I haven't even talked about all the other threats in the world. And I just give you one example where, again, behavioral science is urgently needed. This is a report that came out last year, The Emerging Risk of Virtual Societal Warfare by the RAND Corporation. And what they basically identified as a problem unfolding in many countries of the world is that we have a decline, or they observe a decline of trust in institutions such as media. And that decline, and those institutions have helped as of now to sustain agreed upon social truths. We have a weakening of measures of social capital, meaning civic engagement goes down. We have increasing partisan polarization in many countries of the world. We have rise of populist movements. We have among the citizens a sense of alienation and loss of agency. And talking about predictions for the next decade, what they predict is, you can debate that certainly, but what they predict is that they speak of a death of reality, and they even point to the year 2023. And what they have in mind, and I think that's an important observation, is this. Through digitalization, through social media, what we are experiencing is a fragmentation of the world. And what that means is potentially that we no longer can agree on one reality that we take for granted. And what that means is it will undermine the role of science. It will undermine the role of evidence because evidence will be challenged. And that's what they have in mind when they speak of the death of reality. Now, for all of these problems, and this again is just an example, think also about the health problems that I showed you, we need behavioral sciences. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, not only do we live in times of crisis, but we also live in times in which behavioral science receives more attention than ever before. And there's no question in my mind that this is due, and all the thanks should go to them, to two people. These two people are Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And they wrote in 2008 a book that is called Nudge. What they did in that book is they drew on behavioral science about what we know, how people make decisions, and suggested that based on that evidence, we can really offer solutions for the problems of the world. And you cannot overestimate the impact of that book. Basically, what they did is they put behavioral science on the map. And just to illustrate that with this graph is, this is drawn up by the Organization of Economic Development and Cooperation, and basically they identify all the places in the world that in one way or another are using behavioral insights in order to inform policymakers. And basically what you see is that these places exist all over the world, and some of them have become very famous. Maybe the two most famous ones are the nudge unit that used to be located in Downing Street 10 in the UK, and it was instigated originally by David Cameron. And Cass Sunstein himself, who is a professor of law at the Harvard Law School, he was the czar of regulation in the Obama administration, and there also brought in behavioral science in order to inform regulations. Now, I should also say these are not just only nudge units, because my own institute is also listed here, the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, and I do know, as far as I can tell, that there are no nudges at that unit, at that institute, but we see ourselves mostly as working in the spirit of enlightenment. And what that means, I'll come to that in a second. Now, interestingly, and I talked to Kavita yesterday, of course, the topic of nudging is also very on time in India. And here I found a newspaper article from 2019 in the Times of India, which headlines, "India needs behavioral econ units today," and then they are featuring Cass Sunstein in that article. In other words, also in India, you have that very discussion. How can we as behavioral scientists help to inform public policy making? Now, what I don't like about that headline is the focus is all on behavioral econ. I should say psychology is at least as important as behavioral economics. And a lot of the research that has been done to inform nudging comes from psychology. And I should admit, I'm a psychologist, so I feel a little bit, want to try to defend my territory here. So, okay. They were very influential, and they get all the credit and gratitude for that. So what did they really say? According to the nudges, how do people make decisions? Now, they present what one could describe as a relatively dark, as a relatively pessimistic view of human decision making. And that's not just my impression. That impression you will get immediately when you read just only the first or two chapters of that book. And I brought a few quotations along. So what they say, for instance, is humans predictably err. Human forecasts are flawed and biased. Human decision making is not great either. We are mindless, passive decision makers. We often make mistakes because we rely too much on our automatic system. Many people will take whatever option requires the least effort or the path of least resistance. Inertia, status quo, and the whatever heuristic describes our decision making. And they also invoke the metaphor of Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, I'm sure many of you know, is the anti-hero of this famous American cartoon series. And Homer Simpson stands for a lot of bad qualities about humans, about us. Homer Simpson is lazy, he's inert, he lacks intellectual curiosity, he's a couch potato, he's full of prejudice. And what they are saying is that that's us. That's you, that's me, that's us. Homer Simpson lurks in all of us. And that is not too surprising, this view, because this view has been the mainstream view since the 1970s, since the research by Kahneman and Tversky. And what you find in many textbooks of psychology and psychological decision making are lists like this. All the mistakes that people are committing. We are overconfident, we suffer from the hindsight bias, we commit the conjunction fallacy, and so on, and so on, and so on. Actually, if you go to the Wikipedia entry of cognitive illusions, what you will find is at this point over 200 cognitive illusions, allegedly. And Richard Thaler, who was a close collaborator both of Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, already in the 1990s said this sentence, and it's an important one: mental illusions should be considered the rule rather than the exception. In other words, these mistakes that's not the exception. That's how we are. That happens all the time. All the time we make these mistakes. And it's not just Joe Public who commits all these mistakes, but it's also the experts among us. We all do it. We all fall prey to these mistakes. Now, let's just for a moment look at one of these terms, mental illusions. That's really a very tricky one. It's an important one, but let's think a little bit more about that. Why is he using the term mental illusions? Now, he uses it because Kahneman introduced the term of cognitive illusions. But when you hear the term cognitive illusions, of course, you immediately think of visual illusions, right? You all know what visual illusions are. Now, visual illusions, I brought you one example, are illusions of our visual system that we somehow cannot correct. Now, if you look at that, then probably all of you see, and tell me if you don't see it, all of you see that on the top, the dots are popping out, and on the ground, they are popping in, right? In other words, they are convex on top and concave on the bottom. Do you see that? This is a famous, by the way, this is a famous illustration by an Indian visual scientist who works in San Diego, Ramachandran, and I love this illustration. Now, let me turn that around. It's the same, yeah? Cool, right? Now, everything that was convex becomes concave, and everything that was concave becomes convex. Now, in the discussion, if you want me to, I tell you why that is. Right now, I won't tell you. The important point is this: even after I told you, you will still see it. You will not be able to walk away from that cognitive illusion. And that's the important implication of cognitive illusion. In a way, we cannot walk away from it. So even if we are being told about it, these things are so resilient, so robust, we cannot walk away from it. At least that's the view. Now, here comes an interesting point. If you read the literature on the efficiency of our visual system, nobody doubts the existence of visual illusions. But everybody will tell you how incredibly efficient our visual system is. Nobody has the idea to say the visual system is irrational because of the visual illusions. The literature is full of admiration for what the visual system can do. Now, that's totally different once we move from the visual system to the cognitive system. Once we talk about the cognitive system, we are not in awe, at least not in that line of literature, about the efficiency of the cognitive system. No, the opposite. We are basically complaining about the irrationality of that system. And if you go to any bookstore, you find these books that all mention the same message. We are predictably irrational, that's Dan Ariely. Robert Schiller speaks of irrational exuberance. Richard Thaler in his new books speaks of misbehaving. And Danny Kahneman in a very famous book speaks of thinking fast and slow and focuses again on the illusions. Now, that view and that message that we are so profoundly irrational was incredibly and has been incredibly successful. And it has gone far beyond the border of the academic discourse and has basically spread into the public discourse. And I just brought you along one statement by The Economist invoking the work by Kahneman and Tversky, and they summarize it as, well, it's clear, human beings, you, and me, we are fallible, we are lazy, we're stupid, we are greedy, and we are weak. And that also holds for you. Right? That's the message. Now, let's assume that this is correct for the time being. Let's assume it's correct. What that means is that let's not try to make people better, because it's a vain effort. It's not going to work. These cognitive illusions will not go away. Rather, and I think that's the brilliance of the nudge approach, rather, let's use people's mistakes to their benefit. And that's the idea of nudging. Let me tell you a little bit about how it works. So the idea is that there is in principle a stable decision-making error, the outcome of which is bad for the chooser. Then what we do is that we are not trying to target people's competences, tell them do it better or enlighten them. Rather, what we do is we build a decision environment around them, and the decision environment in combination with the deficit that people have pulls them in the right direction. How that works, I'll give you a few examples in a minute. Now, for that to work, we need to make two assumptions, two important assumptions. One is, I, the choice architect, the person, the public policy maker who builds the choice architecture, I need to be knowledgeable. Knowledgeable means I need to know what your better self really wants. Not what you are actually doing, because obviously that is to your detriment, but what the better self of you wants. In other words, I know more than you do. And I need to be benevolent, because of course I could also build a choice architecture, and commercial choice architectures do that all the time, that pulls you in another direction, that exploits you. But I need to assume that the public choice architect is benevolent. Now that's a very strong assumption, because if you look around in the world, I'm not sure whether we can rely on that. But it's an assumption that you need to make in order for this to work. Then after the nudging intervention, you need to be able to show that the person is better off. That's the welfare criterion. Better off. Otherwise, you are not entitled to do that. Otherwise, you are experimenting with people not to their benefit, but to their detriment. And then you are not entitled to do that. And that's important, nudges are meant to be easily reversible. And what is meant with that? Now, nudging in principle sounds very paternalistic. I know what's better for you, and now I'm building an environment that pulls you in the right direction. That's paternalistic. But I combine it with libertarianism in the sense that the nudge itself is easily reversible. I leave it up to you to undo the nudge. That's what's meant with easily reversible. And by so doing, we can combine a libertarian idea and a paternalistic approach. And it becomes libertarian paternalism. Okay, so that's a bit abstract. Let me give you a few examples. The 3 examples that I will give you, they're all taken from the original book. Let's look at them in more detail. So this is the first example. What you see here is basically a highway. A highway, it's a street across Lake Michigan in Chicago, and basically at that corner the problem begins. At that corner basically there's a curve. And the problem, as you may imagine, is that these cars coming down here, they are going too fast. Now what's the traditional policymaker going to do? The traditional policymaker is putting a speed sign there, saying, basically telling the car driver, please don't drive so fast. And if that problem persists, I put a radar there and start fining people. That's not what the Chicago traffic planners did. They did something that preceded the nudging, but then was basically used by the nudgers as an example. So what the traffic planners did is really smart. They put these vertical white lines onto the street. Now, unbeknownst to the car driver, the distance between the vertical stripe gets smaller and smaller. And what does that mean? It means that you have the perception that although you have the same speed, that you are speeding up, and you're compensating that with going down in your speed. And then there you have the effect that you want. So what I'm doing here is I build a choice architecture. I rely on the visual system not being able to figure that out. So the visual system makes a mistake. I exploit that and thereby get exactly the effect that I want. That's one example. Now you could debate that, is that easily reversible? Don't know. But let's leave that at the side for the time being. Here's another example. That's a very famous one. It's also often invoked in the nudging literature. And that's a problem that many countries in the world fight. India also has it. Organ donation, a scarcity of organs. Many people are on waiting lists, die on waiting lists because they are waiting for organs. And here's an analysis from 2003 looking at European countries. You see 2 kinds of countries, the blue countries and the yellow countries. The blue countries have a very high consent rate. So these are not the actual rates of organ donations, but these are just the consent to being an organ donor given the circumstances as such. And what you see is that there are countries such as Austria or France which almost have 100% consent rate. And then you have the yellow countries such as, for instance, Germany or UK or Netherlands that have much, much, much lower consent rates. How can that be? Why is that possible? Now the standard explanation would be people just have different preferences, and somehow the Austrians are more altruistic than the Germans, or the Belgians are more, the French are more altruistic than the Belgians. No. No, not really. I mean, Austrians and Germans have not such widely different social preferences. The reason is choice architecture. In the blue countries, you basically have a choice architecture that says this. Everybody by definition is an organ donor, and if you don't want to be one, you have to opt out. You have to come to me as the policymaker and tell me that that's not what you want. And here comes the assumption, people are inert, they are lazy, they will accept the default. And there you are. Everybody's potentially an organ donor. Isn't that wonderful? Now, the countries on the yellow side are the opt-in countries. In other words, here nobody's an organ donor by definition, by default, And you have to opt in. You have to say explicitly, I want to become an organ donor. Now, that analysis had a huge impact. It basically started a discussion in all kinds of countries about how to organize organ donation. And it also is a discussion that is happening here in India. Actually, I don't know what exactly the situation is, but according to this journal article in 2017, it was claimed organ donation, India should follow France and switch to a presumed consent system. So in other words, to an opt-out system. Everybody's consent is assumed. Is that how it's now implemented in India? No? So what, do we still have an opt-in system? Okay. Now you are a public policy maker. Would you change that? Who would change it to a presumed opt-in system? To a presumed opt-out system. Who would do that? Who would not change it? Okay, so you seem like... You will a presumed opt-out. Okay. Do you think it makes a difference? Yes. Of course it makes it, right? I mean, we just saw that. Did we? Well, everybody reacts like you. Everybody says, yes, of course it makes a difference. It's obvious that it makes a difference because we just saw the data. Keep in mind, these are not the organ donation rates. These are just the consent rates, right? Now, here a famous economist, George Lowenstein, said making organ donation the default option rather than just an opt-in choice dramatically increases rates of donation. That's the assumption under which everybody operates. And that's what the policymaker does. Now, the great thing about bringing behavioral science to public policymaking is that we are bringing evidence to public policymaking. In other words, we should ask the question, does it make a difference? Because only then we are entitled to put it in place. Now, there happens to be a number of studies that looked at that because it seems to be so convincing. And the most recent study is this one. It was published in 2019, Kidney International. So what this study did, it looked at 35 OECD countries, 17 of which are opt-out, 18 are opt-in. Perfect. Now we can really look whether it makes a difference or not. Now it looks a bit complicated. Let me just focus your attention on a few numbers. So what's described here are the total decreased donors in both systems. Opt-out 20.3 per 1 million, in opt-in 15.4 in 1 million, which is a not statistical significant difference. The only statistical significant difference really that occurs happens for total living donors. There are 4.8 in the opt-out system and 15.7 in the opt-in system. In other words, the moment you have opt-out, nobody wants to be a living organ donor anymore. That motivation is being crowded out. And now maybe let's look at one more number. Let's look at the overall solid organ transplantation in both systems. 61.6 in the opt-out countries, 61.7 in the opt-in countries, and that brings the message home. It makes no difference. It makes no difference. Now, two things are important about that. First, look at the evidence. Things can be very persuasive, but in the end, you need to look at the evidence. And this is good evidence that we have that it seems to not live up to that promise that was attached to it. First point. Second, if you want to know why that is, ask me in a discussion. Let's go to the third example. The third example is also a very interesting example. It deals with obesity. Obesity is another one of these global worldwide problems, happens in many countries of the world, also in India. I come to that in a second. And the idea of the nudges was to say, let's try to redesign early on school cafeterias because we need to intervene when people are still young. And what they discovered about school cafeterias that they are often constructed by commercial choice architects, meaning that you often have an architecture where at the checkout counter all the unhealthy things are being located. Like you come in and the first thing that you see, there's the dessert and there's chocolate and so on and so on and so on, and you get drawn to that. And the healthy stuff is in the back, the salads, and is in the cooler, and you have to walk over. Now again comes in the assumption of inertia, People are too lazy to walk over. They get drawn to the things that are on eye level in immediate vicinity. That's what they take. So let's redesign the choice architecture in a way that the healthy stuff is right in front of you and the unhealthy stuff is over there. And now inertia works toward in your favor, right? That's the idea. And we'll talk about that later on. But it's really an interesting idea. Now, what I should also say, these are 3 examples. Now I think you have gotten a sense of we rebuild the world in ways that our stupidities work in our favor, that our motivational deficits and our cognitive illusions work in our favor. That's the idea. That's the innovative core of the idea of nudging. I should also say these were just 3 examples. By now there are many, many other examples. In other words, this is not a one-trick pony, but there are many examples of that kind. And if you are interested, go to that paper by Cass Sunstein, where he lists a lot of what he calls freedom-preserving tools or nudges. That's important, freedom-preserving. In other words, again, the idea that in the end, the person has the choice to not follow the nudge. Okay. Now I told you quite a bit about nudging. Let's step back for a moment. Let's think again about these notions of rationality. Because what you see here is that the notion that underlies nudging is the idea of irrationality. And the question that I want to discuss with you for the next 5 minutes is, what does the evidence actually say about this strong premise? In other words, how stable are the cognitive illusions and how irrational are we really? Now, I will not be able to go in much detail. What I will do is 2 things. I will give you ideas and I give you literature pointers. And then I really ask you, it's up to you, go and read that literature. This is not a religion. This is an academic discourse. And you for yourself need to decide which of the arguments on which side really convinced you, right? So that's what I'm going to do. So cognitive illusions, remember Thaler said that's the rule rather than the exception, and there's this long list of cognitive illusions. And they are cognitive illusions, they are stable. It's very hard to actually get rid of them. Now, here comes the first argument. The argument goes back to work that mostly unfolded at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, and Michelle is also going to talk about that in terms of the topic of risk literacy. Now, a lot of the illustration of cognitive illusions have to do with the fact that we all have problems understanding probabilistic information if it's expressed in terms of probabilities. And what this work showed is that a lot of the cognitive illusions can be reduced or even eliminated if we move from probabilities to frequencies. Because frequencies are much easier to think about and to understand. And I later on will give you one example for that in order to make that clearer. In other words, cognitive illusions can be corrected. It's not that they are totally impervious to change, not at all. Second point is, in the literature, what you find recently is really a claim and a discussion about how fragile are these effects. Take, for instance, loss aversion. Loss aversion is basically, by some people, hailed as one of the most important findings of the last 50 years about human decision making. Loss aversion means that if we gain a certain amount of money or lose a certain amount of money, and the amount of monies are equally large, $100 losing or $100 winning, then we value the loss much, much stronger than the gain, though the amounts are the same. So in other words, losses feel much stronger to us, have a much higher psychological impact than respective gains. That's called loss aversion. And loss aversion is used in all kinds of domains in order to explain our behavior. Now, there are 2 studies here that are review and meta-analyses, and they question the robustness of this effect. In fact, some of the authors are arguing this effect may not even exist. And keep that in mind, because people have gotten a Nobel Prize for effects like this. And now we have systematic meta-analyses, and the picture looks different than the claim that this is such a ubiquitous effect. Here's another topic: conceptual argument, representative design. How were all these studies that show all the mistakes, how were they conducted? Now, they were often conducted in a way, and that is totally legitimate, where people thought about, how do I elicit that mistake? Then I design a task, Linda task, the maternity ward problem, engineer lawyer problem. I design this task, bring it in a laboratory, show that you make a mistake, and I'm done. Now what this is a highly selected sample of the task environment that we as people face in the world. And the question that you may ask, if you want to really find out how good or bad people are, shouldn't we bring a representative sample of the tasks in the world into the laboratory? And that's a totally different approach, because here the point often was just the existence proof of a mistake. It was not to find out what's the real performance level of people. For that, you need to do different kinds of experiments. So that's the topic of representative design. Now, there's also a debate about what are the right norms of human rationality. In the Kahneman-Tversky literature, in the Olympian idea of rationality, it's what's called coherence-based rationality. And what is meant with that is there are kind of basic rules of rationality, such as coherence or completeness of preferences, and so on. And they basically should hold no matter where we are and how we behave. They are always true. They are internal truths of rationality. That's one way of looking at rationality, but there's a totally different one, and it's called ecological rationality, which says, no, in each situation, other norms of rationality may play a role. In one situation, it's about accuracy. In the next one, it's about speed. In the third one, it's about trust. In the next one, it's about transparency and being understandable. These are totally different norms of reasonable behavior, and if we measure people against those norms, they may look much better than if we measure them against these coherence-based norms. There's also the argument that a lot of the irrationalities or cognitive illusions that occur is actually an expression of constraint optimization. So in other words, heuristics are totally irrational. That's now the Can-Arrow view. Remember the very first one where Simon said that's forget about that, comes in by arguing, no, heuristics are actually optimized procedures. They are constraint optimization. And the last one, which is also very interesting, is so in some cases the argument has been made that what has been claimed to be a fallacy is not a fallacy whatsoever. A very famous paper deals with the so-called hot hand fallacy. It's basically the belief that if you watch basketball, that you believe that some players have a hot hand, and famous researchers such as Amos Tversky have argued that's a fallacy. These people don't have a hot hand. Now it turns out that in this paper, and it has been published in Econometrica, this is not any just paper, basically shows that hot hand fallacy exists in small samples, and that the mistake resides with the researcher, not with the people. I say again, this is not, you don't need to be, I want you to read up on that. Make up your own mind. But what I want to convey to you is that if you read the nudge literature, you get one subsample of the behavioral science evidence. And that is only one subsample. And what I want to introduce you to is to the wide range of different views. And there's totally other views on our abilities to make decisions. That is not to say that there are not enormous problems in the world. There are for many reasons enormous problems. We have pointed to them. But that doesn't mean that we need to believe that people are unable to get better, to become more competent. Okay. And with that, let me come to one final quick discussion, and then we go to boosting. There are many research programs, and that reinforces the point that I just made. Many research programs in my field that suggest that there's much more than cognitive flawed software. There's the argument of ecological rationality. I won't say much more about that. I talked about that, and you will hear much more about that in this conference. But I also want to point you to 3 other programs. Again, there is plurality of views. Before Kahneman and Tversky came along in 1970s and basically showed us all that we are so profoundly irrational, there was a research program at the time called Man as Intuitive Statistician. I replaced man here with human as intuitive statistician for obvious reasons. Now, there's a famous paper by Peterson and Beach in Psychological Bulletin that reviewed over 150 empirical studies. And the conclusion across these empirical body was, people are surprisingly good intuitive statisticians. And if we want to understand human cognition, we should start with the models of statistics and probability theory. They are great starting points for understanding human cognition. Now imagine that. That's the absolute opposite message than the one that Kahneman and Tversky told us. And it's empirical research, is evidence-based. And you may ask the question, how can that be? How can it be that in the 50s and 60s we believed in an intuitive statistician, and then since the 1970s we believe the opposite? If you want to find out the answer to that, ask me in the discussion. I also want to point you to another author that is really interesting. It's Gary Klein, who worked on what's called natural decision-making and the power of experience. And he said, well, if I really want to understand how rational people are, I don't go to the lab. What I do go is I go into the field. I study police officers, I study nurses, I study physicians, I study firefighters. And what he found, and that's what he called the sources of power, how people make decisions, what he found is that people are surprisingly good. And he believed that people are so good because they are powerful pattern matchers. And what is meant with that is that he believes that we have a huge repertoire of situations of the past, and we match the new situations with that repertoire of the past. And that past can then give us hints as to how we should solve the current problem. There's also the view, whether you believe it or not, that's a different story. There's also the view that the human mind is basically a Bayesian mind, and we are, at least qualitatively speaking, acting as if we are Bayesians. Now again, you don't need to believe any of this, but make up your own mind and realize, and don't believe just one of these stories. Don't believe just one of these views on rationality. You need to dig deeper, and you need to find out for yourself, what do you want to believe here? And look at the evidence. Okay, so with that, let's come to boosting. So what I hope that I try to convince you is, yes, indeed, this is a very persuasive message that we are so irrational. But it's really not the only one. There are many other pieces of evidence that suggest that we may be much more competent than we are made out to be. And if that's the case, then there's an alternative possible, namely an alternative set of interventions in the policymaker's toolbox that allows us to make people more competent. So what we have in mind with Boost, and when I say we, I mean in particular a colleague of mine, Till Grüne-Janov, who is a philosopher, and I, who have worked on this notion of boosting, at least conceptually speaking. And what we mean with boosts is really target the competences and not the immediate behavior. Remember in the nudge examples, we are interested in behavior. We change the car driver's behavior. We don't change the competences. But here, I want to change the competences because I want the behavior to be left to the person. I want the autonomy to be left with the person. I can do that by aiming at domain-specific boosts or competences, such as financial accounting. I could give you an example for that. Or domain general competences, statistical literacy, and Michelle is going to talk about that in quite detail. We can target human cognition, so the mind, but we can also target the world, and we can target the combination. Remember, heuristics and environments interact. And the goal is we want to preserve agency, and we want to enable individuals to exercise their own agency. And that means that these boosts, unlike the nudges, need to be transparent to the person. Because if you are not understanding that you are being boosted, you cannot engage with the boost. And that's a very different approach. In nudging, in principle, I could nudge you, the car drivers, and you have no awareness that you are being nudged. And there's always the potential problem of manipulation. Now, I should also say, like in the case of nudge, it's not a one-trick pony. There are many different kinds of interventions that can be called boosts, and they work across many different domains. I won't go into detail. Instead, what I will do is, let me give you two examples, right? Okay. The first one is what I call a 1-minute boost. I emphasize the 1 minute, I'll boost you. I hope so, at least. And it's 1 minute in the sense that nudges are often very efficient. They seem so efficient. That's so tempting to policymakers. I just need to change one word in my law and make everybody and make the opt-in to an opt-out system, and all the problems are solved. That's the idea, right? That's what's so tempting about the nudging. And that means is that boosting in comparison seems like effortful. But is it really so effortful? Let me give you a 1-minute boost. Now this is an advertisement that actually is a real advertisement used by the pharmaceutical industry, and what is being advertised is a medication. It's Lipitor. And Lipitor is a medication against stroke. And Lipitor, so the claim here, which is correct, cuts the risk by nearly half. So what does it cut? It says in patients with type 2 diabetes and at least one other risk factor for heart disease, Lipitor reduced the risk of stroke by 48%. Now I take it that if you belong to that risk group, you want that medication, right? 48%? That's a lot. So shouldn't you have it? Shouldn't you take it? Well, let's see. What's the problem here? The problem is this is a relative risk communication, a communication in terms of relative risk. Lipitor reduces the chance of stroke by 48%. Problem is you have no clue what the effect size is. Because think about it. What does 48% mean? Think of a group of 1,000 people who belong to that risk group. 48% could mean a reduction from 1,000 to 500. That's great. Take it. But it could also mean a reduction of 100 to 50. It could also mean a reduction from 10 to 5. It could also mean a reduction of 1 to 0.5 in 1,000 people. That's all consistent with 48%. In other words, this is a commercial nudge. It basically convinces you and stops your thinking. What we really want to know at this place is absolute risks. We want the real frequencies. And if you read the real frequencies, what you read is this. Lipitor reduces the chance of stroke from 28 in 1,000 to 15 in 1,000, which is a reduction by 13 in 1,000, and that's a reduction of 1.3%. Now 1.3% reads different than 48%, right? Now to make it a little bit even more insidious, what the pharmaceutical industry sometimes does is they use mismatched framing. In other words, when they talk about the benefits, then they want big numbers. So then I talk to you in terms of relative risk reduction. But when I talk about the side effects, I want the numbers to be small. So then I switch to frequencies. And that is very misleading. And here's the boost. The boost is very simple. Whenever somebody comes to you and talks to you about statistics in relative terms, probabilistic terms, and not in absolute frequencies, don't accept that. Whether you are in the financial industry, in the medical industry, or anywhere else, don't accept that. Ask for the absolute numbers. Stop the conversation and say, tell me the absolute numbers. That's the boost. And with that, I have boosted you. And I hope that stays with you for the rest of your life. Okay, so one example. Boosting doesn't mean that I have to send people back to schools. I can boost you and you risk literacy within a few minutes. This was just one example. Now let's look at a different one. Obesity. Big problem all over the world and also a problem in India. Now this is a study from 2019 and the study looked at basically the evidence over the last 20 years. And these are the numbers for different regions of India. And basically it shows the obesity rates, which is a body mass index higher than 30 for men and women. And basically I can go over the numbers, but basically the numbers are high. The numbers are too high for comfort. And that will put an enormous burden on the healthcare system in India. There are some regularities, such as, for instance, the numbers are higher for women than for men. The numbers are higher the more you go to the south than relative to the north. Now, how can we think about that? How can we solve that problem? Well, first of all, there's no one single solution, right? I mean, let's put that out. Remember what I said earlier, that was the proposal of the nudger. The nudger is to say, let's redesign the school cafeterias. Now let me make me very clear, I think that's a good idea. I see no reason why we should leave the school cafeteria to the commercial choice architects, because they don't necessarily have our welfare in mind. They have commercial interests, understandably, in mind. So take that back and let the benevolent public choice architects redesign it on the basis of behavioral science evidence. That's fine. But if you really believe that this solves the problem, then of course you're totally benighted. Because this means that we are just redesigning one environment and then we throw our kids into many other commercially constructed choice architectures, in particular when they walk home from school. They walk through commercially constructed choice architectures which are full of temptations. But we haven't equipped them with any competences because our point was nudging them. But we can only nudge them in this one place. We have not the control over all the other places. And what that means is that we also need to equip our children with competences. Without competences, they cannot deal with those toxic choice environments. How do they do that? How can you do that? Now, there are different ways of doing that. Let me tell you about one way. One way is to start even earlier. Start in the family. Because if you think about it, by age 10, a child has consumed 10,000 meals, most of them in the environment, in a family environment. What that means is that the family environment is an incredibly rich environment for learning. And here what we did is we did a meta-analysis looking at many different studies, and what we found is basically we found a negative association between family meal frequencies and BMI, the body mass index. What that means is that the more often kids eat in the family, the better their nutritional health. Now, the effect is as I described, but it's not a very strong one. And the question is, why is the family meal environment not even more powerful than we assumed here? And the reason, or that we hope for, the reason is because very often family meals don't look like that, at least in Western. That's what we call the IKEA version of family meals. So you have like happy parents, happy children, eating freshly prepared food, and everything is wonderful. That's not how many family meals look like, but family meals look often like that. We're not talking to each other, we are distracting by TV or digital means. We are ordered a pizza and having freshly prepared food. Now what that means is that we can harbor the effect, the positive effect of family meals better by making the parents competent choice architects of their own environment. That's the idea. Making them competent architects of their own choice environment. And you can do that. And we did that by basically conducting a lot of different meta-analysis and thereby identifying simple things that parents can do in order to turn it into a more healthy environment in their family, the family meal. First of all, parental modeling. Parents need to understand whatever they do at the table presents a model to the children. If you want your children to eat healthy and not overeat on desserts, don't do it yourself. Don't preach water and drink the wine. That's the idea. Positive mood, that's an interesting one. Keep up a positive mood at the family table. Why? Because if there are fights all over at the family table, what children can learn, that's the risk, that they learn emotional eating. They learn that they can regulate their emotions through food. And that's the worst they can learn. So in other words, if you want to discuss bad grades in school, wait until after the family dinner. Turn the TV off. Turn digital media off. Don't be distracted as the parent. Prepare the food freshly. If ideally involve the children in the preparation of the food, and interestingly and counterintuitively take a bit more time than less for eating. Because it turns out the more time people dedicate to eating, the more healthy they eat, the less dessert they eat. Now, it's totally clear to me that in many family environments you cannot do all these things. But sometimes it's enough to do one of these things. Just already doing one of these things or two of these things can turn that rich learning environment into one that is even more conducive to the health of their children. Okay, second example. Let me step for a moment, and I come also to the end now. You may understand my talk as saying you have to decide between boosting and nudging. Now, that's actually not my argument. My argument is that what we really need to do, and that is in the spirit of ecological rationality, you need to think about when would you like to boost and when would you like to nudge. And when you do so, there's one problem. You should keep that in mind. And that problem has been spelled out in this paper here. Namely that nudging has option value. Now it sounds a bit, what is option value? Basically the intuition behind this, it's a game theoretic analysis, is this. The nudgers have a strategic advantage. If you are a nudging policy architect, you may want to nudge people even if boosting turns out to be better for them, because once you start boosting them, the cognitive illusion is gone. You cannot exploit it in the future, and that means you can no longer nudge. And what that means is that you may have public choice architects who stick to nudging, though in that particular intervention boosting would be better, but you are giving up the bias. That's a general argument. But if you think more precisely about the conditions, then the argument that I pointed out in this paper was that if the individual goals are uncertain, if you do not know what the better self really wants, you should not nudge people, because you may be totally wrong in your assumptions about what the person really wants. If there are highly heterogeneous preferences, you should also boost and not nudge, because nudge is a one-size-fits-all solution, right? And if there are many different preferences, leave it to the person to act out their preferences. If the policymaker's goal is to produce lasting and active behavior, you should probably boost and not nudge, because basically nudging means that we are not activating the behavior of the person. The person in a way learns to be not thinking anymore. If the nudge only works if it is non-transparent to the person, and if it has detrimental side effects, you should definitely boost and not nudge. And last but not least, and that's the example, take again the example of the food environment. If it's a toxic environment where we only have control over one aspect, like the school cafeteria, but there are many other environments, then you need to also boost people. It cannot be enough. We cannot just nudge people. And with that, let me come to one final example of a boost that I love very much, because also it's a metaphor for the distinction between nudging and boosting. There's wonderful research by Carol Dweck, who is a psychologist at Stanford University, who made the distinction between two mindsets. And basically what she is saying is that all of us have two different theories about how our mind works. And she calls one the fixed mindset and the other the growth mindset. And with the fixed mindset, what she means is that that's the belief that basically we are born with a particular intelligence, and this intelligence is static. There's nothing to be done about it. We're either as smart as we are or as stupid as we are. There's nothing to be done about that. Now, this belief, it's a belief. This belief has consequences, and she points out the consequences, such as, for instance, that we don't accept challenges anymore, that we walk away from challenges, that we get quickly frustrated, we are not motivated enough to take on new challenges, and so on and so on. So in other words, it becomes to a self-fulfilling prophecy that our intelligence is static. And there's what she calls the growth mindset, which is exactly the opposite. It's the belief that, yeah, I'm certainly born with some kind of intelligence, but who cares? Because I can get better. I can accept new challenges. I can expose myself to new challenges. I can learn new things. And learning new things is fun. It's great. Sometimes I fail, so but what? Then as Madhu said, then you stand up after the fourth round revision rejection and try it all over again. That's what she calls the growth mindset. And there's lots of evidence that these consequences have an enormous role. And recently, in 2019, she has basically published a field study, a US-wide national experiment in which she basically did one thing. She did an online growth mindset intervention, which basically consisted in telling people and teaching people in a 1-hour intervention, it's a 1-hour intervention, that intellectual abilities can be developed. We are not stuck. We are not stuck in here. We can grow. And basically what she finds in that study is that this intervention, 1 hour, improved grades among lower achieving students and increased overall enrollment to advanced mathematics courses in a nationally representative sample of students in secondary education in the United States. That's just one example. Why I like this so much? Because what I do think is that this idea of a static mindset is actually the idea of nudging. We're irrational, we're stupid, we cannot grow. And the idea of the growth mindset is the idea of boosting. We can get better, we can grow. That doesn't mean that we are not making mistakes, we make them quite a bit, but we can also grow. Thank you. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Oh, summaries, okay.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful paper. There is a lot, I don't know how much justice I'll be able to do. Yeah. He started by constructing the bounded rationality of Herbert Simon. He gave 3 interpretations that give rise to 2 approaches for public policy. One is nudging and the other is boosting. So he says that the differences lies in the theoretical construct and the practical policy. So that is very important. Then he says why this world is unrealistic. Then he goes to Ralph Key's depiction of Olympian rationality. He says that we have not only one objective but several objectives. How can we infer probabilities of the objectives? So he goes on to explain what bounded rationality is, how do we make decisions. In that he gives three notions that have emerged. One is the optimization under constraints, cognitive illusions, and the heuristic. It emphasizes on the processes rather than outcome. Now the question is no longer about rational or irrational, he says, but mostly about ecological rationality. He says that we need to look in the three books he mentioned: Ecological Rational, Intelligence in the World, Simple Heuristics. Then he goes on to say that their true interpretation that cognitive illusions and about cognitive illusions. He gave several explanations about how do we make decisions or how rational we are. But he says that he is not championing one idea over other, but that analysis was important to make a ground to explain the nudging approach and the boosting approach. Then he uses many examples to show the how one is being nudged, with the organ donation example poster, then with the school cafeteria. Then he quotes some from his book, from the books regarding the nudge theory. He says that Sunstein and Thaler has described how human is predictably irrational, or how cognitive illusions are stable. He says that all mistakes people commit, they are conjunction fallacies, overconfidence bias. Mistakes are inevitable. It is how we are as people, and we foreplay with the mistakes. Then he moves on to visual systems to cognitive systems, from visual systems to cognitive systems. He says that we are rational has been spread to the public. That we are irrational has been spread to the public. Human beings are fallible, weak, greedy and fallible. Then, when I was talking about the introduction about the human rationality, then he about the nudge approach. When there were evidences from the nudge approach that humans are intuitive statisticians or natural decision-making processes. Human mind is a Bayesian mind. Human mind is an adaptive toolbox. With that, he comes to the boosting. Boosting, he does not emphasize. He does not give. He just asks us to boost intervention because it changes the competencies rather than the immediate behavior. Behavior is to be left to the person, since autonomy is to be left to the person. Boosts need to be transparent to the boosted individual. So nudge approach seems very tempting, but boosting seems affordable. But is it affordable? So he explains it with a elliptical, phonetical nudge. Then he says that boosting does not mean same as school. Nudge redesigns the architecture. It is just redesigning the environment, but we are throwing people to the commercially structured markets. So we need to empower the competencies. So how do we do that? So he gave the example of the family. We need to start with the family. In terms of ecological rationality, he says we need to think when you would like to boost and when we have to nudge. Nudging has optimal option value. If individual goals are uncertain, you should not nudge. Nudge is one bit full if better preferences, then leave or the person onto the person. If nudge only works, not only transparent, but boost works. If it is toxic environment, we need to boost people and cannot just nudge people. Thank you.
I talk too much, I realize. So, do you guys have questions?
You can raise your hand, the mic will be passed on to you.
Oh.
Very simple technical
Yeah.
question. You gave a chart with organ donation, where you mentioned that Belgium is much better than Germany. Could you now explain
What the problem is?
Yes.
So that's a very good question. It's a question that's still being discussed. For instance, currently right now in Germany, because the German health minister, similar to the Indian health minister, is also proposing to switch from an opt-in to an opt-out system. And they are all operating under the assumption that this is correct, that basically what we see in terms of this graph is also a good predictor for the different organ donation rates. And why is that not? There are a couple of reasons. There's not just one reason. So one reason is that at least in Germany, but that also seems to be the case in other countries as well, you have big hospitals and you have small hospitals. And for organ donation to make possible, you need to keep a lot of infrastructure in place. And the small hospitals cannot keep that in place. It's financially not feasible for them, which means that you can change that. But that doesn't mean that the financial incentive system for the small hospital changes. First reason. Second reason, it turns out that no matter what the original person said, I want to be an organ donor or not, the moment one of the relatives is being asked and tells the doctor, I don't want the organ to be removed, the doctor will, in all likelihood, not remove the organ. In other words, there's the theory of the law and there's the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is if the relatives object, then it doesn't matter what the person really said. And that holds both in the opt-in and in the opt-out system. And then there's a final point, and that's actually a really interesting one, is that this graph suggests that the reference class of people we should be interested in is the whole population. But that's not correct. The real reference class that is of interest is how many people end up in a situation where they could be organ donors. And that's a stable amount of numbers per year. And it's a very small, we're talking about in Germany with 80 million people, we're talking about a few thousand people. And so because a lot of circumstances have to come together that you are an organ donor. Now within these few thousand people, most of the organs are being harvested. Most of those people are already being organ donors. In other words, by changing the reference class in the population, you are not changing the fact that there's a bottleneck. That bottleneck will be in place. So in other words, this graph, as interesting as it was, it kind of drew our attention to other factors that may play a role but are not the key factors in the production of organs, in other words. Those are the reasons that seem to be very important in that debate. You're welcome. Other questions?
You said nudging has option value. I wasn't able to understand that.
It's basically, it's a paper that exceeds by far my mathematical abilities, although I'm supposedly an author on that paper. It's a game theoretic analysis, and basically what it shows is that if you analyze the interaction, the strategic interaction between a policymaker and the people who are being nudged or boosted, then it turns out that there are circumstances under which a policymaker says, I know that in this intervention I should really boost people, but if I boost them and take the cognitive illusion away, then I lose the ability in the future at other occasions to actually nudge them. And what that means is that in that trade-off between doing something good now and being able to exploit cognitive illusions in the future, I basically say, no, I won't do that because I want to have the liberty to nudge people in the future. That's the idea of the option value. And the idea being is that once you boost people, then at least that particular cognitive illusion is going to be removed and is no longer available to me as a public policymaker. That's the intuition of the result that we found. Okay?
So,
Here.
I just wanted to know, at the individual level, would nudging be a part of the process towards boosting?
Can you spell it out? What do you mean with that?
So when you talk of developing competencies, so competencies which an individual might not be aware of, but you try to nudge him towards that. So I say that 100 nudges will lead to a boosting on this competency. Could that be a...
So are you saying that can I nudge people toward being boosted? To accept a boost? Is that what you... I never thought about that. So I think that is, I think it's possible. I think also it's legitimate to the extent that the decision, so I can nudge people toward engaging with the boost. I think that's what I can do. But what's important is that that decision, whether I engage with the boost or not, needs to be a conscious, deliberate one, and also requires to some extent motivational engagement. Because I will not, like, remember the 1 minute boost that I gave you? You engaged with it. You were with me. But if a person says, oh, now it comes to numbers, I'm not even going to look at that because I don't understand numbers, then I have no chance to boost you, even if I have nudged you toward paying attention to me. So in other words, yeah, I think you probably could use all kinds of means to bring people closer to boosts, but then in the very end, there is some minimal motivation necessary. Otherwise, the boost is not going to work. Yeah? Please.
Sir, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understood is that you talked about the obvious solution to problem solving is to improve your competencies, but by inherent nature, we are not, we are bound to make mistakes, and we want to use that to the problem solving. So we have two solutions for that, nudging and boosting. Nudging is about creating an environment to around the mistakes that we do and to help them do a problem solving. And boosting is about instilling a change in behavior in people to the problems, to solve the problems. But how is boosting different from improving your competencies, which was the earlier solution?
Which was what?
Which was the obvious solution to improve the competencies and to do less mistakes. We can still do mistakes in our behaviors in boosting.
Not totally certain that I understand the question, but to the extent that I understand it, what I would say is that what we try to do with boosting is to correct the picture. In the sense that if you now, you see it also in the debate in India, when people talk about bringing behavioral science evidence to public policymakers, the emphasis is all on nudging. And nudge, and that's the point that I tried to make at the very beginning, nudge comes with a lot of theoretical commitments about human rationality. And the commitment is a very strong one. The commitment is we are making mistakes as a rule rather than the exceptions. And these mistakes cannot be corrected. So these are all very strong theoretical commitments. And they do suggest a certain way of approaching public policy problems. And what we try to do is that we try to balance the picture and try to tell you guys, but also the public, is that the behavioral science evidence is not as dark and as pessimistic about human nature as it is suggested by the nudging approach. We can grow, we can become competent. And the real question for me is, and you could say that this is obvious, and if you think that this is obvious, then I wish that all public policymakers would also accept that as obvious and also implement that to some extent. And the real question in the end for me is, however, to think more carefully about what are the circumstances under which I should bet on nudging, changing the choice architecture, and when should I also give people the autonomy to decide? When should I try to boost them? That's really the challenge, and that is not obvious, because there you need to take you need to think harder, you need to analyze the problem. And that is then the next challenge that behavioral scientists face, to run that kind of analysis.
My question will be much more philosophical. Take it into instance the bounded rationality, the idea of bounded rationality is basically irrational. The idea of being irrational, the human mind being irrational. So is it much more related to Friedrich Nietzsche's ideology of cynicism. You know, Nietzsche's ideology of cynicism.
Nietzsche. You're talking about Nietzsche. Okay. So I like Nietzsche a lot, but I've never thought about Nietzsche in the context of bounded rationality. I have to admit. Now, Nietzsche has basically said everything and anything and the opposite, which is unfortunate about Nietzsche because you could, Nietzsche talked both about the irrationality aspect, irrationality of human, but he talked also about their strengths, by the way. So I wouldn't see an easy connection to make between Nietzsche and his philosophy and also his understanding of the human mind and the notion of bounded rationality. I think the notion of bounded rationality, and there's not just one, as I try to point out, there are different ones, is a rather unique 20th century, second half of the 20th century development, which I don't see an easy connection between Nietzsche and that, but I'm very happy to discuss that in more detail in the break.
So in your example of the family meal, how is boosting working? So you found some insights into some solutions that you can adopt in order to improve your outcomes, right?
Yeah.
What are the boosts? Then you have to make people change the way they have their family meals, right? So how do we go about it?
That's a very good question, because basically what we up to this point have only done, we have identified what we call simple rules that you could apply. Now the next step would be to take these simple rules and communicate it to the parents in a way that they can easily implement them and also have the motivation to implement them. Now we are thinking about how can we communicate that? How can we basically instill that competence in the parents? And you could do that through a wide way of means. You can do it through like when parents go to the doctor, to the pediatrician, that there's a brochure. You can do it through apps that you download. There are many different pathways that we try to bring that knowledge. And the knowledge itself is almost in terms of heuristics. Namely, it's as simple as that. If the TV is on while you start eating, turn the TV off. So it's basically procedural rules that you can relatively easily implement, assuming that parents have the intention to engage with that, have the motivation to redesign the choice architecture. Now here comes another point, and that's an important one. What I have not talked about is the following. We have nudging and we have boosting. But we have also something third that we have started writing about, is what we call self-nudging. And self-nudging means is that in the past, nudging means that I'm the policy architect and you are the person who is being nudged. So I have all the knowledge and I keep it by myself, and then I nudge you. But there's no reason to assume that we cannot share the knowledge that the nudger has about how the human mind works and empower the person to become a self-nudger. We do that all the time. So for instance, when you are at home, at least when I'm at home, I really like Swiss chocolate and I like it too much. So what do? I nudge myself. I nudge myself in the sense that I change my choice architecture. So I take the chocolate when I buy it and I don't put it on the first level of the refrigerator. So whenever I open the refrigerator, I look at it. And I know that when I look at it, I cannot resist the temptation. So I put it somewhere else so that I cannot see it. I know it's there, but I don't immediately see it. So I even forget about its existence. And what that means, and that's a very simple example, but in many regards, we are smart. We can redesign our choice architectures as the parents can redesign a family meal environment. But what that means is that we need to let the people into our secrets of psychology. We should empower people to become choice architects by themselves. Why shouldn't they be allowed to redesign the environments? Because the wisdom that we have collected in nudging and in boosting can be shared with people. And that makes them autonomous, that makes them, and it also makes them to the experimentalists of their own life and of their own environment. And that's the idea that we have called self-nudging. Okay, I think that is nudging. I heard the signal, and I thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.